Well, good afternoon. I hope you had a good lunch and some good discussions and opportunities to network. We're able now to move on to our next panel on building blocks, new plans for new plans. And I'll ask the speakers on this panel if you'd like to come up and take your seat. This session will be moderated by Alan Eisendrath, who's the acting director of USAID's Office of Global Climate Change, Economic Growth, Education and Environment, East 3 Bureau. And Alan, as you can see from his bio, has the purview of focusing on large-scale renewable energy systems, integration of renewables into modern energy grids, regulation, and competitive procurement of infrastructure. You see that he comes with quite a vast experience, having worked on electricity reform in a number of countries, from Afghanistan to Bangladesh, the Philippines, Marshall Islands, and the Palestinian Authority's West Bank, among many others. So, Alan, I'll hand it over to you for this session. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger Mark. I thought Roger Mark had already put the 3-minute in front of me, but I guess that's for someone else. Welcome to the panel on the building blocks for scaling up. A central theme of this conference is that renewables are reaching price parity with conventional thermal. That's a very positive bit of news as we go into the COP. But as we've seen, if you isolate renewables from the larger issues in the development of a power system, you're going to have a number of challenges that have to be addressed. What are countries doing to drive large increases in renewable energy? What are the requirements other than low prices, and what is driving low prices? What are some of the things that are causing the scale up? That's what this panel is about. A key message here is that a number of building blocks or drivers are being successfully used in many countries around the world. This panel is an opportunity to hear different views on what is driving large-scale renewables growth and to hold a dialogue on key trends in this space. As an introduction, I'd like to briefly mention USAID's perspectives on the building blocks. From our view, and that's the view of the Energy Division and the Global Climate Change Office, there are 6 key building blocks. The first is competitive procurement of renewable energy. That's reverse auctions and competitive auctions for renewables. The second is smart incentives, and that refers to incentives that evolve over time and with experience. The third is concentrated resource zones. An example of that is the concentrated renewable energy zone in Texas, where there's a lot of wind capacity. The fourth is effective grid integration, and that's basically dealing with the variability of wind and solar PV. The sun and the wind go up and down, and the system has to be able to accommodate that. The fifth is climate planning. Our representative from Citibank, Mike, mentioned how important climate planning is to scaling up. It's an important driver of countries' choices in installing renewables. And then last but not least is innovative financing. That's a topic that was highlighted in the first panel. All of these are critical to what countries like Germany, the UK, Brazil, India, China, and the United States are doing to go to scale with renewables. This panel will give us the opportunity to compare notes and look at alternative views on the building blocks. Have we identified the right ones? Are there additional ones that we have not thought about or that we should add to the list? What are other practitioners seeing in terms of drivers to scale? And more generally, what can we do that will drive scaling up at levels that will really impact climate change? Are there things that we can add to the building blocks? Are there new approaches? That's what we're going to discuss today. Now I'll introduce our panelists. Each of our distinguished panelists will offer their views regarding the building blocks for scaling up, starting with a brief personal introduction. I'll not give the introduction because I'm sure that there are some features of each of the distinguished panelists that they would like to share with you. We will follow each presentation with 3 or 4 comments or questions. And then at the end, I hope that there will be time left for an open discussion of all 3 of the presentations and the general topic of the building blocks. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce our first speaker, David Owens, Executive Vice President of the Edison Electric Institute. David, I yield the floor to you.
Well, thank you for this tremendous opportunity to be here today. Let me tell you a little bit more about myself. I'm an engineer by background, have graduate degrees in electrical engineering and graduate degree in energy management. I have over 35 years experience in the utility industry. I worked on all aspects of our industry. I worked for General Electric. I worked for utility. I was a regulator for 10 years. And now I work for the Trade Association, a national or international trade association for privately owned electric companies. These privately owned electric companies, if you just focus on the U.S., they serve about 70% of our end users. It's an industry that is very capital intensive. In fact, we probably commit, our budgets this year are over $100 billion that we'll be spending on all aspects of our infrastructure. And if we focus just for the moment on the energy delivery system, which is kind of key to our conversation today, we're spending about $23 billion on our distribution systems and about $11 billion on our transmission systems. And we're an industry which is undergoing tremendous transformation. In all the years that I've been with the industry, I've never seen a period much more exciting than what we're confronted with today. All aspects of our business are being transformed very significantly. Our relations with our customers, our power supply, our total energy delivery system, and our business models. So this is a very exciting time to be in the industry, but it's also a very challenging time. What I intend to do today is kind of give you a snapshot of some of these issues tied to the major themes that were just discussed with you. Today I'm aided by a very brief PowerPoint presentation, and I don't have a clicker. So, okay, great, thank you. So let me kind of start out by giving you just the historical perspective of our industry. If you look back in 2005, you'll note quite strikingly that about 50% of our power supply was produced from burning coal. And you'll notice as well that 19% was roughly, 20% was roughly nuclear, and close to 19% was natural gas, and the remaining portions were nuclear. Now just look 10 years forward, look at today, and it's very significant what is taking place today. Let me be very simplistic. 1/3 of the electric power fleet is zero carbon emitting. Now that's very significant. 1/3 is natural gas. So roughly 2/3 of our fleet is what I would call relatively clean. So we've made some tremendous transitions. You can see as well there's a significant increase in renewable technologies. Renewables represent about 11% of our power supply. So that's transformative when we look at the electric industry. We are strong advocates of clean energy, and we're demonstrating that leadership by the transitioning of our fleet. Now, some of it is government driven. A lot of it is driven by individual preferences by our industry. You can even look at that even more closely and see the mix. You'll see that wind comprises a larger portion of all our renewable technologies, but increasingly solar is having a much more significant role. And if I could just for the moment just focus on the solar technologies. You're absolutely right. The price of solar energy has been rapidly declining. Just look at in 2011 and look at 2014. And you can almost see a 50% decline in the price of rooftop solar and utility scale solar. Now, there's a huge debate in the United States about solar energy, and I'll get into that momentarily. But I show this slide for several reasons. I show it to demonstrate the strong commitment that we have to renewables, but I also show it to show the strong commitment that the electric industry has to solar energy. If I look at this slide more carefully, you would see that rooftop solar is twice the cost of utility scale solar. If you look at this slide very carefully, obviously it would suggest to you that if you're concerned about our carbon footprint, that utility scale solar, in fact, has a much more significant reduction of our carbon footprint. If you look at this slide more closely, you would say, if you don't own a roof, you can't get solar. So utility scale solar gives the customer the opportunity, if they don't have a roof, if they can't afford to put on rooftop solar, utility scale solar is a universal service solar. And there's a huge debate in the United States. 60% of the solar that was installed as of the end of last year was utility scale solar. Significant debate in the U.S. I think it's a viable source for us to address climate change. So I'm convincing you that there's a major transformation of our power supply fleet. There's another transformation taking place. This is of our grid. When I started my career, we were building central station power plants. We had what we call dispatchable power supply. We had to also had predictable demand. We now have distributed energy resources. We have a hybrid electric system that's evolving. We have a system that's relying less on central station power plants and more on distributed resources. Obviously, that creates challenges for the integration of these technologies into the grid. One big debate that is occurring throughout the states are the distinction between those customers who have the ability to put on rooftop solar and those customers who don't. And there's a big debate that's occurring throughout the states about a potential cost shifting. The debate goes something like this. The grid is being modernized. Right now we have 65 million smart meters. We're moving the grid from an analog grid to a digitized grid. It means that we have to make substantial new investments. I said $23 billion, and that's what we're doing. We're putting in more automatic controls, sensors, and monitors. There's a cost associated with that. So those who rely on the grid should pay for the grid. Huge debate going on in the United States about a concept called net energy metering. When the customer sells the energy back or credits the bill for their excess solar energy, do you credit it at the retail rate or do you credit it at the wholesale rate? Let's talk more about this distribution system. This distribution system has certain characteristics that always demonstrated the commitment to keeping the lights on. Increased resiliency and overall reliability. In other words, as we begin to move towards a hybrid grid, it's very important that we preserve the fundamentals of that grid. It's very important that as we integrate these distributed resources, that we do it in a way where we maintain reliability and resiliency. So that means that you've got to be able to have some visibility over those resources. You've got to be able to acknowledge the multidirectional flows that are taking place, and you've got to be able to integrate other forms of distributed resources, such as microgrids. Microgrids are another form of giving the customer some additional belief that they have greater resiliency and greater reliability. And microgrids are evolving very significantly here in the States, and I know abroad they are as well. The other thing, too, is we have to make sure that if you're operating that electric system, you have constant situational awareness. You know all that is taking place on your system. You also need to have some good sense of the characteristics of those distributed resources that you're seeking to integrate. See, there's a distinction between interconnection and integration, and sometimes people get those very confused. It's not connecting a wire, it's now making sure that that overall planning is very integral to what the utility control operator does. It's making sure that those sources are sources that are viable, that can be called upon. Traditionally, we talked about dispatchability. Today, it's important if you have rooftop solar that you have a sense because you have a grid platform and you're seeking to integrate those sources. So having smart inverters is very important. So there's ongoing communication between the utility function and the distributed energy resource. That's also important when you look at the concept of microgrids, which are growing very significantly. Our Department of Defense believes that it's very important that they maintain some higher level of resiliency. So many of them are building their own internal networks, have their own power supply, but they still rely on the backbone of the bulk power electric grid. Significant developments that are taking place in that. Again, these areas are transformational when you look at the changes taking place in the grid. So there are a number of public policy questions that are raised when we look at this. Who plans for the grid? Who builds the grid? Who operates the grid? Can you go behind the meter? Who operates that market that's evolving? Traditionally, those were your traditional utility, who planned, built, operated the grid, and ran the market. But we're moving into a transformative state, which suggests that the utility has a different role, but they still have the responsibility of serving all customers that demand it. They still have the responsibility of providing reliable service. They still have the responsibility of maintaining some level of resiliency. These are very vital questions that are being asked in states that are looking at the utility of the future. And I generally boil it down to this. I boil it down that the grid is the essential element of all of this. The grid optimizes independence or choice for the customer, that the grid optimizes value to the customer, that the grid optimizes the customer's goals for sustainability. Now, the grid that I started my career in was the grid on the far left, where the utility had a lot of control. The grid that we're evolving into is the grid in the middle, and I think it's the one that talks about value-based open access. We're moving to a grid now where we value the broad range of services, not only from solar facilities, but also from the grid. See, the grid provides ramping services. The grid provides backup supply. The grid provides VAR support. The grid has a balancing function. The grid has a regulation function. All of these are essential attributes of reliability. When I look at reliability, I break it into two components. I look at it as balancing or keeping supply and demand in balance, and I look at it as security. So we're in a path now, we're looking at what is the role of the utility and what is the role of the grid. So right now, many of my members are saying, what is the business model that I need to go forward with? Do I totally unbundle my system? What do I do? They're all guided by three essential elements: reliability, sustainability, and affordability. We are in a pathway now to decide who will have the responsibility of integrating all of these distributive resources, who will have the responsibility of operating that grid, who will have the responsibility of getting behind the meter. See, I have a bias here. I think all three of these areas, the distribution system integrator, the entity that integrates all the distributive energy resources, the one that makes sure that the system is operated to maintain a level of reliability and resiliency, I think is the utility. And getting behind the meter to provide the customer a broader range of services, I also think it's the utility. So thank you for your time and attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, David. That was an excellent overview of how things are evolving to accommodate large-scale renewable energy and to maintain reliability, sustainability, and affordability. We have time for 2 or 3 questions, and then we'll move on to the next presentation. Sir.
David, have you taken a look at working with large-scale developers, home builders, where rooftop
They're asking questions in between speakers.
leverage.
Yes, and so the question really relates to larger scale solar, but working with builders and developers. I guess I would call that community-based solar. Yes, we are. We're working many of my members are working very closely with them. They're working with universities. They're working with smart cities who are seeking to integrate not only a larger scale solar where the community has a share in it, but also they're seeking to integrate telecommunications and transportation. I think that's a very efficient way to do it. You protect reliability, resiliency, and you achieve much more significant sustainability goals. So yes, I find tremendous value in that, and it's a universal component as well.
One comment on that, insofar as a lot of the newer communities have circular streets. So
That's right.
not all roofs face south. You may have to evolve towards a grid like we used to have, so you have south-facing roofs. And I don't know
right.
whether there's a movement in that regard.
Yeah, let me just say there are pilots that are looking at that. I guess there are 23 smart cities that are being looked at, and several of them are reviewing that concept. We all know, too, that there's an issue of costs. Who bears that burden? And that's one of the issues that's being presented here. But excellent question.
My name's Norman. I'll try to contact you after the meeting.
I appreciate
Thank you.
that, Norman. Yes.
Reading articles say that in Arizona and Hawaii both,
Yes.
that the local the local grid is beginning to insist on charging back solar for residential. Do you see that going forward? And if everybody has to have pay a fee in order to install a solar system, that's going to drive the price the wrong way.
Okay, let me, if I might, set the record straight here. So we all know that the grid was a grid that didn't account for tremendous bidirectional, multidirectional flows. So we know that we've got to make new investments in that grid to modernize it. That's where I made the reference to the $23 billion. So a rooftop solar customer relies on that grid. So when the sun isn't shining, when the wind is in the evening, and if they don't have long-term battery backup, they rely on that grid. So the question becomes, when that customer has excess energy, what should they be paid? If they are paid the retail electricity price, if the customer's retail rate is 11 cents and you give them an 11-cent credit, there's no contribution going to the fixed costs or to the grid. And that's really what the debate is about. And I think in order to ensure that there's not an element of cost shifting, there has to be some recognition that there is a component of the grid that the rooftop solar customer is relying on. States will look at this approach very, very differently, but the fundamental issue is there is a cost shift.
Okay, we can take two more questions. Please identify yourself and let us know your name when you ask the question.
Doug Shackelford with D4 Energy.
Okay, Doug, thank you. Next.
Thank you, Doug.
Any other questions?
Eric Hochstausen with USAID. Thanks for the informative presentation. I wonder if there are lessons that you would extrapolate from the U.S. experience to the developing world.
Yeah, there's several lessons that I would suggest. Let me first comment that I don't want the U.S. to go down the European route, and I'm not trying to be flippant by saying that. See, I believe that you need to have the utility intimately involved in the planning and the operations of the grid as it evolves. I think a lot of tension is created when you separate all those functions into little discrete parts, and I think it creates tension between the distribution system operator and the transmission system operator. I also believe that you don't have the level of transparency. So I think that's something that the U.S. is looking at, and I would just encourage the U.S. to continue to look at distribution system operators as those that have the overall operating experience. Traditional utilities, I think, can do a better job. My last comment would be the rate designs are very critical. And it's just not the rate design with respect to the excellent question that was asked about rooftop solar. There's a whole set of things that we can learn from looking at overseas. You got to unbundle those components of that grid. They're a broad array of services. You got to be able to measure those services and price those services. That's an evolving art. And when you move down that pendulum, you'll get to something called transactive energy. So this is a dialogue taking place in the U.S. You're further along in other parts of the world. We can learn from one another.
Thank you, David. I think that goes to the time allocated for this presentation. We'll have more Q&A at the end, but I just wanted to say that I think David successfully came up, he innovated a new building block in the first presentation, and that it seems to me that it's an evolving utility. It's a utility industry that is working with the scaling up of renewables and supporting the integration as well as the scaling up. So that's a new one for our list. Thank you, David. Okay, our next presentation will be made by Nisha Tirumurti, Senior Project Leader, National Renewable Energy Laboratory. Nisha, do you want to begin by giving us a little bit of background on yourself?
Sure, happy to. And may I actually present from there? 'Cause
Sure,
I'm not
please.
going to have a good angle, and I
Please.
wasn't smart enough to print out my presentation, so
Yes.
thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so just by way of background, I've been working in the energy industry for about 16 plus years. After I completed my education, I actually have a degree from SAIS. Some of you SAISers might be here, plus an MBA from Dartmouth Tuck School, so it was a dual degree. And after that, I joined Deloitte, and I did quite a bit of work in the South China region, where they had, the utility there was facing issues with their emissions, and also China at the time was talking about deregulating their energy industry, and this particular utility was wondering what that would mean for their assets because they were relying on natural gas for their base load. Long story. After that, I ended up actually at the Clinton Foundation, at the Clinton Climate Initiative, and I was working on the deployment side of deploying advanced automotive technologies in cities around the world. So a lot of my work was in Brazil, India, Colombia, and I also work with suppliers in Europe and China, including the US. And then I guess I've spent my longest time here at NREL, which is a fantastic place to work, I have to say. It's really interesting projects. And I've kind of done many different things. I've supported the Department of Defense in, I shouldn't say, really Army, Navy, and Air Force in their individual goals of deploying 1 gigawatt of renewable energy capacity across their installations. So doing a lot of the technical and financial analysis around that. And I also have supported microgrids, developing microgrids in India. This is off-grid microgrids. And I should say to David's point, DoD is definitely in the whole microgrid mindset for energy resiliency and energy security. So that's a paramount goal for them. And lastly, most recently, I've been assisting many countries in the Caribbean and Africa to come up with their greenhouse gas mitigation targets ahead of the summit in Paris. So different type of work. But anyway, just to get started, let's see. Okay, so the main points I'm going to touch on in this presentation is, first, I'm going to talk about why are resource assessments important for the deployment of renewable energy. Second is, I'm going to talk a little bit about improvements in data access, impact of advances in technology and modeling capabilities on resource assessments. So we've been able to collect a lot more data, so what does that mean? The third is improvements in accessing this data. Well, you have tons of data, but how do you access it in a way that many stakeholders can use it to their ends? And also how do we present the data? So the value of visualization and analysis. So how do we take resource data, but then pair it with other really critical GIS-based information to tell us what we need to know in the context of everything else that's going on? And also, then I'll just wrap up with some examples of some tools and some of the things that you can do. So why is resource assessment important? Well, renewable energy resources are characterized by their locational concentration. So what does that mean? So it means where are the best resources? How do we identify those? how much of each resource is available in the specific area? When are these resources available for generation? And how do different factors impact the theoretical, technical, economic, and market potential? When I say theoretical, I mean theoretically, just by physics, we know when the sun shines in a specific area, you're going to get some electricity. So that's the theoretical aspect. The technical is, can you really tap into it? What if there's shading? What are some of the other technical issues that impact how much of the resource you can actually capture? Economic is the cost effectiveness, so to speak. Are there transmission lines nearby? Can you develop this resource in a cost effective way so people will be willing to pay for it? And then the last is market potential. What is the regulatory environment? Are there incentives that will help deployment of these resources? So who benefits from high quality data? Everybody. So we have those who are actually making policies, like policymakers, who may want to know annual aggregated solar data. So how much is the generation potential in my country, and what type of targets should I set? Power system operators might need it on a very granular level. When is peak? When is the peak load? When is this resource available? So they would need it on a very, very granular level to figure out how to deploy that resource to meet the needs of the electricity needs. And project developers, they need it to be able to just figure out, where can I develop this resource? And generally, they're looking at hourly data, at least on a 15-minute to an hourly data on, where they can develop the resource. And they also want to know how close is it to infrastructure, transmission lines, et cetera. And investors need it to make sure that the project developers are giving them the right information. So they run their own models. So everybody in the kind of value chain, if you will, requires this data. So data quality and quantity has improved substantially over the last decade as a result of improvements in technology and modeling techniques. So the figure on the left there is a study that NREL did back in 2001 to figure out the wind resource potential in the Philippines. And we came up with about 44.2 gigawatts. But in 2014, USAID, the EC-LEDS program, funded NREL again to determine, what's the new, what's the, an update to that. And you can see it's 5 times what we came up with in 2001. And that's for several reasons. One, wind technology and turbines themselves have improved. So you can measure wind now. You need to measure wind at different levels, 30 meters, 50 meters, 80 meters, 100, 140, 200 meters. What is the wind potential there? And of course, modeling techniques, the sophistication of modeling techniques have also improved. So you're able to capture 4 terabytes of data, which includes annual, monthly, hourly wind speed, power density, all the technical stuff that would be important to determine how good the resource is. And so we've moved away from just having static maps with nice, colorful, blobs everywhere to something that's more dynamic that people can access for their needs. And of course, improve modeling and data storage. So how do you access 4 terabytes? I mean, it wouldn't make sense to give you 4 big laptop worth of data, right? It didn't make sense for us to have that. Well, how do we access it in a way that's meaningful to us? So we now have different tools that take the different data and visualize, and you can visualize it, you can query it, and in this case, you can look at the wind speed. This is the wind prospector tool. By the way, the links for all of these tools are in the back of the presentation, so it's all publicly accessible. You can go in and play with it. And this is for the Philippines. So you can query it, visualize, overlay it, look at it with other GIS data like infrastructure. Where's the infrastructure? Where's the resource? What's the best place for me to develop? And you can also download this information. So you can just take what you need and download it, and then manipulate it. Same here, this data can be filtered in a manner that allows users to download just what they need for decision making. So it's just that. It obviously saves time, saves storage space, right? Processing time. Okay, and also to transition into visualization, here The main idea behind this is you want to lower the cost of exploration and project risk. So if a tool can give you that, that means you don't have to be on the ground measuring all this on your own. So you pull up a tool. If you have no constraints, I think this is in Vietnam, a province in Vietnam, you have no constraints on the left. Well, you have 40,000 megawatt capacity of wind in this instance. Well, you can't develop it everywhere, right? There are protected areas, so you can overlay protected areas on top of where wind is available, and it breaks it down, whittles it down to about 23,000 megawatts. But if you're a developer, you're going to say, well, where are the transmission lines? I want to be close to a transmission line. So then you whittle it down even further, and you really have, in terms of low-hanging projects, about 2,600 megawatts of capacity that's developable in a cost-effective manner in this. So this gives you a first cut analysis before you go down and start digging deeper. But what about those areas that have excellent resource, but may not be cost-effective? So in this analysis, and this is something that Alan talked about, is in Texas, we've developed renewable energy zones where it gives you where the resource is good, and what this does is it aids policymakers to figure out, okay, where should we build transmission capacity? What are the areas that we can exploit that may not be cost effective right now, but we can make cost effective if all the other infrastructure were in place? And this is yet another way. So this is another one of these tools where policymakers can also determine renewable energy opportunities in areas of high poverty and or low electrification that can help contribute to economic development. So on the left side, you see the level of economic development, poverty areas. On the right, you see the electrification rate in those areas. In the middle is the resource. So you can figure out where to develop, where the resource is good and where you can have the greatest impact. So here, tools assist the user select different areas on a map for exploration and compare the potential for renewable energy development between different locations. And in this case, users can also download their own data and also, download the data and also replace their own data for NREL data. So all of the data that is used to develop these tools is publicly available, but there might be some proprietary data that people have that they can then upload. And in this case, you can, zero in on a specific area, and it'll tell you in that 50-mile radius what are all of the biomass resources available, so that you can explore that site. Same with geothermal. You click on a specific area, just draw a box. It tells you the available wells, their temperatures, land use, environmental restrictions, and that gives you your first cut, free of cost. Free of, just to figure out where you should go looking for opportunities. And the other thing, just a point I want to mention is that these tools allow for interoperability. What that means is the data is in a specific format, it's GIS based, and so IRENA the data still resides in NREL, but IRENA can tap into that data and have their own interface and show the information in their own way. And this is yet another tool where you have thousands and thousands of maps available behind the scenes, but it's also historical data. So for example, if you wanted to see how competitive wind is with other fuels over a 40-year period, when wind prices are higher than other fuels, this can tell you that. This is kind of what it's showing. It's showing you how the other resources are deployed in comparison to wind. And if you're planning, let's say, another project in that area, you can see the impact that project would have on your renewable resource. So major takeaways are just that, we need to have, in order to have credible renewable energy analysis and planning and investments, they depend on the availability of high quality data, and improvements in modeling techniques have, and technologies have really, and also data processing have allowed us to move away from the static maps to having more dynamic data that can be accessed in many different ways by different stakeholders. And data by itself is not enough. You need to have the visualization and other GIS methods and information that we have layered on top of that to see how we can best use this resource to achieve our objectives. And that's my contact, and those are some of the links that you can go to access all of that information. Thank you.
Thank you, Nisha. That was really good. We started out with USAID's 6 building blocks. David gave us a new building block, which is reminding us that smart, evolving utilities and as integrators is an important part of the process of scaling up. And Nisha did a great job of showing us that smart data analysis and high-quality tools is a key part of the process of scaling up as well. So I think we're getting some real interesting innovation and thinking about the building blocks now. Finally, I'm very pleased to introduce Dennis Volk, Program Officer, International Renewable Energy Agency. Dennis, would you like to speak from there or from the podium?
I'll go to the podium.
Okay, then you.
I'll move it, yeah. Let me just switch seats.
I think it's the one at the bottom. Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you very much for the kind words, for the introduction, and also for the invitation for IRENA to be here. It's a pleasure to represent IRENA today. Well, before I go into the details, maybe 1 or 2 words on my personal vita. I used to be a regulator for 5.5 years, working in the German administration. That was an interesting time because that was when we started opening up our markets for electricity and also gas towards competition. And it was also the time when we started to massively upscale renewable resources. And while we were still busy in getting the markets right, in fact, for just competition, we realized that the market rules have to be again adapted for integration of renewables and also for the development of renewables. So it was quite a busy time, but I learned a lot, and I'm still benefiting from it, I guess. I moved to work more in the international sphere of energy and electricity. I started working for the International Energy Agency, based in Paris, again focusing on power systems. But I also had the opportunity to work together with people on coal and gas, etc., which was quite interesting because coming from Germany by that time already was giving you the idea that the world is full of renewables only. But and as much I'd like to say this now in my current role as well, it is a matter of fact that power systems probably will for a long time be built on a combination of fuels for being reliable and affordable, but also sustainable. So we are working on this. Now I'm at IRENA. IRENA brings me to many interesting places, most of the time to developing countries, but also from time to time I'd be happy to come over and also to DC today to present what we're doing. And yeah, well, I show you just this one slide for those of you who are not very familiar with what IRENA actually is. And where we are. So IRENA is an intergovernmental organization. So our members and also funding partners are the countries of the world, the governments. We have at the moment 143 member countries and another 30 states being in various degrees of accession. So that means actually that our task is global. That also means that our knowledge is global. That's quite exciting and interesting because we can then tap into various good practices from really across the globe and try to bring these to other jurisdictions and make them fit in the specific jurisdictional contexts. We are sitting, our headquarters is sitting in Abu Dhabi. That's also where I am based. That's also the reason why I'm terribly jet-lagged. But anyway. But we also have an innovation technology center which is sitting in Bonn, in Germany. We've been around since 2011, and our core mandate and our only mandate is to accelerate the deployment of renewable energy. So whenever you speak to guys like me, the answer will be renewables, of course. Right? Okay. So where do I provide these answers to? Oh, I work in a team which provides these answers to governments directly. We have teams which are working more on generic products, knowledge products, studies, etc. And then we have a team I'm sitting in as well, directly engaging with stakeholders on the ground, ministries, regulators, system operators, etc., also investors, in trying to push the green agenda forward. And we have developed clean energy corridors for reaching out to several countries in one go. We use these clean energy corridors to move into the region, but also as we move closer into these regions, we are then also expanding our work and going more in depth and starting to work sub-regional towards even the national and sometimes the local level. So this is the Africa Clean Energy Corridor you're seeing here, which is our flagship initiative, which has been around since 2014. It's been backed up by the ministers of energy. So they asked us to come in and support them with the development of renewable resources. And what we did at the beginning was we did scope the needs of where actually IRENA could make a difference. So for them, for most of these countries, actually, the question was about resource assessment, and we had Nisha giving us this great presentation on resource assessment. I have 2 slides on this as well. I can build on what you already introduced and be brief on these things. We have completed resource assessments in Eastern and Southern Africa already, and we are moving into Western Africa as I stand here right now. And based on the findings from the resource assessment, which allow you to identify how much resources do you actually have, where do you have them, and what would it actually cost to explore them, we have engaged in long-term development planning for the energy and the power systems, trying to elaborate on the future role of renewables in the region towards 2030. So that is what we have also published in terms of studies working together with the system operators and system planners in Africa and the southern and eastern African power pools. And through that we have, I guess, already made a good impact for them to create more awareness of renewables actually becoming more and more cost competitive and actually expanding their role today and also in the future. And then, while we are still not in the game for all renewable technologies that they are cost competitive, there is specific tasks for regulators and ministries to set the rules of the games right so that renewables can grow. And that's what we call the enabling investment or the enabling frameworks for investments. That's what I spend most of my time with. So I try to convince policymakers and regulators in actually implementing support schemes and getting frameworks right also for the reliable integration. And also when they are already convinced, we are helping them, of course, to get the frameworks right. All these activities are then also supported by a specific capacity building, tailor-made capacity building activities, and of course public information matters as well. So our resource assessments would love to, Nisha, actually afterwards to catch up and compare the findings. They should be quite similar, I guess. What you see here is 2 maps. To the left is the raw data, so to speak, for Southern and Eastern Africa with regard to solar potential, solar resource potential. And then we have just incorporated into the model a specific exclusion criteria, and Nisha elaborated on them, and they are quite similar. So we have excluded zones which are protected. We have excluded zones which are already sealed. We have excluded those zones which are far off from any demand centers. We have other exclusions with regard to transmission location. And also we have evaluated the capacity credit, meaning does it actually make sense in that location to produce electricity, wind or solar at a specific given time, giving their generation profiles with regard to the off-takers. Because electricity demand varies, of course, over the course of the day as well. And if you produce electricity overnight and no one's going to need it, the value of this electricity is actually quite low. So we have included this evaluation also in the methodologies, and we came up with then a net potential where we also already identified what would it actually cost to generate electricity and produce electricity at these specific locations. And this is what you see on the right-hand side, where we have scales for solar PV in this regard, scales ranging from 120 US dollars per megawatt hour up to 180 US dollars per megawatt hour. So the redder it gets, the better the resource, the bluer it gets, the more costly it's going to be. Of course, since we did it in the context of this regional agenda, we also want to encourage with this governments working together, actually to explore first these resources which are least cost, and which is quite hard, I must say. We heard in the panel before, also coming from the floor, the question, okay, how many people actually, or what's the barriers for working together, and does it actually happening working together, governments across the borders for developing renewable resources? And I don't see this happening. I really don't see this happening across the globe. There's maybe 1 or 2 cases in Northern Europe where it happens, where governments really just said, okay, we want to deploy renewables at least cost, and we just know if we work together we can save a lot of money, but it's not happening very often. So we are working with these regional decision makers, using also regional bodies, but also national decision makers to actually convince them they can save a lot of money in working together. I realized you showed a map for Kenya, so I show a map for Kenya as well. That's just to elaborate a little bit further on the resource map. What you can do and what we have created is also the level of interactivity, because we didn't want to just produce a map and then walk away. We want the people on the ground to use them for their own purposes. So in this modeling exercise, there's also a lot of assumptions, and it's a very data-heavy product. So the better the data is, obviously, and the better the assumptions are, the better the outcome and the more tailor-made. So what we have produced is actually quite interactive map, and we gave it to the regions and the national decision makers so that they can play with it. So they can change the data, they can change assumptions, etc., etc. In that case, they start owning this product themselves. And that's quite an important part. If they don't believe in what we produce, we've just produced something nice for the bookshelf, which nobody will look at. And it is already quite making a good impact. It's interesting to see that this map also reconfirmed us that we are not too far away from the reality, because the first wind project, which is currently being developed in Kenya, is actually at the Lake Turkana, which is the northern region. And this is exactly also where our resource evaluations have indicated the best potential. So it's not a surprise. And the transmission lines which are going to be developed at the moment for this Lake Turkana project will probably open up a lot of more opportunities. Which brings me to the next part, the enabling investment frameworks and getting the frameworks right. And starting with one case from South Africa. Most of these jurisdictions we deal with are just integrated jurisdictions. So we have one utility which owns the region, or which owns the whole country in terms of electricity supply. And it doesn't really let somebody else in. It does what it can do, and most of these utilities know exactly what they are doing, what they do and what they can do with regard to conventional technologies. It's just a fact that they have a lot and a big steep learning curve when it comes to renewables assessment and integration as well. So sometimes there's a little bit of inertia you have to overcome to actually make this happen. And we have seen this in the case for South Africa, for example, South Africa being just the biggest country in the region. Where Eskom is actually developing an integrated resource plan, asking the question, okay, how will the future of electricity look like towards 2030? And the outcome was at the beginning pretty bad for renewables, which is the green part, the upper part. And then the government stepped in and said, okay, guys, actually we believe the renewables will have to have a bigger share because of various reasons, which led to the revision of this integrated resource plan. You see how big the green share right now is. And this is just because the government intervened and started to say, okay, you guys, when you do your modeling, you need to factor in several aspects, externalities. So what does it actually cost to consume water? Or what does it actually cost, and how harmful is it to have local environmental pollutions, not to even mention the CO2, which is also a big aspect. So all these factors have been taken into consideration. ESCOM had to run again the model, and the outcome was that. So my point here is governments have a big role to play actually in getting the resource plans right. And based on these resource plans, investments will be made. That's the important part to make sure as well. And coming to this point, actually, when you look at the in general at the landscape for investments into renewables in Africa, if you ask an investor, okay, what are the barriers to investments? What are your key risks? And this has been done last time in 2013 by Baker McKenzie. The outcome will probably be, yeah, there's a lot of risk, and you can group them along the lines of political risks, exchange rate risks, and regulatory risks, and some other risks. But these three are just the biggest ones. The political risk in that regard was centering around how stable actually the whole environment is, the political landscape. Is there changes in the leadership? And if there are changes in the leadership, does it actually imply also changes with regard to policy directions? Of course, that is very harmful if you have invested into assets which last for 20 or 25 years. You want to have stability in that regard. Exchange rate, very often these projects are financed, or at least to a certain degree co-financed by money, international money, and of course international investors want to have certainty with regard to the exchange rate. So very often, since the exchange rate towards the dollar is fluctuating quite often, the risk of exchange rate is there in the project as well. And then the whole set of nitty-gritty details for the frameworks, the regulatory parts are quite important, as you can see here as well. And these are the aspects we're tackling in the IRENA as well. These are the aspects I'm tackling with my team. So we just been to Tanzania to see, okay, what can we learn? Is there good practice, or is there practice at all for developing renewable resources? And so one of the first aspects you have to keep in mind when you speak to decision makers in Southern Africa, Eastern Africa, they have a lot of people who live without access to electricity. So in the Tanzania case, we're looking at over 75% of the population not having electricity access. So for them it's not the question actually to develop large-scale projects in most cases. For them it's the question to go more into the small-scale angle, to at least produce some electricity and to start developing mini-grids. And this is what they have been trying already. And the first solution was a policy which they adapted in 2008 for small-scale power producers. But they haven't gotten the details right. So I was just speaking to the electricity regulator, the director there, and he told me, yes, we had this in place since 2008, but nothing happened. So we looked a little bit further in trying to understand what actually was wrong, despite the fact that they had a tariff for these small-scale projects, which was around 2 times higher compared to a project which would be connected to the main grid, the transmission grid. It was just not enough because there were other factors which were just barriers. For example, the first and the biggest part was actually, since we're dealing with small-scale investors and small-scale projects, the amount of regulatory requirements and information to actually start the project and apply with the regulator and get the approval was way too high. So just by pure bureaucracy, a lot of projects have been just pushed aside. Then the interconnection costs as well. In power systems, the question very often comes to the question of who pays. So when you want to use the grid is a service provider, and you can have different views towards who should actually pay for such a service. It's an essential service to have. But if you want to start and establish a new technology like these small-scale renewable technologies in Tanzania, you have to ask yourself the question as a decision maker, how much additional burden from a financial perspective do I actually want to put on this new technology and this new industry to be formed? And the answer very often, and we see this across the globe, is actually you take away the requirements to pay for any grid services for these investors. It wasn't the case in this case, so they had to pay for interconnection agreements. That was a big economic problem for them. There were other aspects, you can see them as well. You had problems with delayed payments with the off-taker, for example, which of course also hinders the business case. So they are currently working to revisit the small-scale power producer framework, and they have also invited us as IRENA to support them in the development, and we are currently trying to connect the dots between the resource assessment we have done on the ground, also with Tanzania, with the small-scale power producer project. And there's other projects we are also running, and just wanted to use this last slide to create awareness of this. So we are working with the regional bodies in Southern Africa and trying to establish good governance practices for integrated resource planning. The slide I showed you before on South Africa amending the resource plan and giving this rise for renewables. That's what we try to do at the moment in the rest of Southern Africa as well. And we also have a lot of capacity building activities going on. We just finalized one, speaking to all countries in Southern Africa on frameworks as well. With this, I think, yes, I want to close. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Dennis. We'll take 3 or 4 questions specifically for Dennis's presentation, and then we'll shift to 15 minutes of discussion about the broader ideas that we've heard here, the building blocks, the evolving utilities, the whole set of ideas. Any questions or comments for Dennis? Tim?
Thanks, Dennis. Great presentation, and Nisha, I saw the overlaps with your work as well. I guess the question I have is how do we integrate the policy side to these maps? How do we get the politics that is the energy independence angle sort of rolled into this? If you take a look at Africa corridor, for instance, we've got energy independence being a notion that's insular, whereas the concept of the corridors is sort of external. Same in Southeast Asia or South Asia, where we have India looking at its own consequences, but really it can't get there without the regional cooperation, Southeast Asia being the same way for most of those countries. How are your maps going to start integrating these sorts of dynamics, and how do we get past the internal independence versus, or energy security question for internal consumption versus external?
Okay, thanks, Tim.
Tim Williamson, State Department.
You want to take that or take another question or two? Okay.
Thanks for this. Okay, fine. It's working? Okay. Thanks for these questions. I guess the answers will be at least twofold. It's economics and its reliability. So when you look at the map, it gives you the opportunity to identify what it would actually cost if you would develop your renewable resources just as a single nation. Let's take the Tanzania case. So what would it cost Tanzania towards 2030 for developing their national resources to reach a specific target share of renewables? And then you can compare this outcome with what it actually would cost if they do this together with their neighboring countries. And this tool actually allows us to see the difference, and the difference can be quite dramatic. So that's the economic angle, which we use, of course, to convince decision makers. And the other angle is the reliability. You can build on various resources at the same time, and that's the beauty of it. So, for example, the northern part of that region we've been looking in is, or the middle part of this region we've been looking into is quite wet, so it works on lots of hydro resources. But then again, you also have droughts and these droughts are actually increasing. So you can actually pool your resources, building transmission lines, interconnectors, and ensure that you have security backup, drawing on resources maybe from the south to be more frequently used and heavily used in times of droughts, and vice versa. If you have in South Africa in the future, you have more reliance on wind, and the wind doesn't blow, you can still import your electricity from the northern parts of the region, from hydro. So these assessments can be done based on these resource locations as well.
At the back of the room, is that Randy?
Yes. Thanks, Alan. Randy Freed with ICF. I would just like to propose an additional building block based on what Dennis presented. I would note that the integrated resource plan that you showed for South Africa, kind of before and after, had a couple interesting aspects to it. One was that if I'm not mistaken, the y-axis scale was displaced downward considerably in the second graph, which I assume may reflect some demand-side management or energy efficiency options. And I think that, an IRP also puts renewables in a broader context that is most important to utility decision makers and the financial community and all the other stakeholders that are essential to really scaling up RE. So I would just propose that probably another building block for scaling renewable energy is having a sound integrated resource plan, or maybe an integrated resource and resilience plan. Thanks.
Comments?
Yeah,
Okay.
just to answer your first question, in fact, it's energy demand-side response. So yeah, they build a lot on peak shaving through this, so they need much less the gigawatts in the future. That's their hope. Yeah.
Okay, one more for Dennis, and then we'll shift to the questions about the broader topic. Anything more for Dennis? Here.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Ibiran Garaguye, and my question is, from the slides, I know you mentioned that East and South Africa were kind of the focus for development, and I was just wondering, like, West Africa is next. Was that strategic, or was that economic, or was it political? The factors is the reason why.
Good question. Yeah, it's been political. So how we work? No, I mean it's not a big problem. And how we started work on this is our work is needs based, and we don't move into regions if we are not invited. So what happened in 2014 is we were sitting together with the ministers of energy, those who wanted to come to the table from Africa. And for Western Africa, there was simply just not the biggest interest at that time. But the good news is that we just concluded a big major stakeholder consultation in Western Africa as well 2 months ago. So what you saw with regard to the implementing pillars on Eastern and Southern Africa, we're going to start working on these things right now as well with West Africa. I guess in 2 years' time we have caught up. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Dennis. That was a great presentation that you made. Now we'll shift for 20 minutes to a general discussion of how the world can scale up renewables to try to meet our climate objectives. And I'd like, since there's been a theme that has been repeated in many of the presentations today, that is what to do with the unconnected rural consumers and poor consumers versus what to do with the large grids. This panel was much more about large grids. All three of our presenters emphasized integrated planning, identifying zones with the best and lowest cost resources. That was a key idea in David's presentation, reliability plus affordability and sustainability. So if you look at this is a question from me if you guys don't mind. If you look at the resource maps, you've got some areas that look like it's really low cost, high value resource that may be way out somewhere far from a population center. And if you're a government facing the choice, do I put a lot of infrastructure in to develop 30,000 megawatts at Lake Turkana, one of the better resources in the world, and try to supply all of Kenya with it, or maybe all of Kenya and a neighboring country? Or should I spend my limited capital budget on village-based systems, home systems, minimal supply? What do you guys think about that?
I can, so building large-scale projects is important, right? Because if you want to try and meet your goals as a country, and just in working on some of the greenhouse gas contributions with some of these countries, they're very much focused on renewable generation, and they have 30%, 40% goals. I was assisting Liberia, which has electrification rate of about 1%, post-Civil War. So a huge portion of their population is dependent on conventional fuels. And they're working on a lot of plans, including a transmission connection between Ivory Coast and Liberia, including some very large-scale hydro plants to scale up quickly in a clean way. And from what I understand, even the transmission connection to the Ivory Coast is supposed to be clean hydro-based generation. So there are some other interesting models out there that I've come across for off-grid. So I do have an interest in off-grid too, but I've worked on the large-scale stuff. Building out transmission lines is one cost, right? If you're building a project, you have to factor that in, cost of transmission and distribution, which can make a project that's economically viable completely unviable. So, and to your point, in your example, when you mentioned in Tanzania, mini grids weren't working because people couldn't afford the connection. There are some interesting models where this is successful in Haiti apparently, where a company sets up a off-grid station, but this can also work with grid connected. So off-grid station, and they supply about 100 battery packs. They charge $6, $7 a month, prepaid. You can come and charge up as many times in a month as you want. So imagine a village that's located close to Turkana, right, that is completely unelectrified, and you rent out battery packs, and you give them and I calculated, they probably consume maybe 2 kilowatt hours a month. Very, very small amount of electricity. You prepay it, and it's competitive with what they're paying for conventional stuff like, traditional stuff like kerosene, which is unhealthy. And you're meeting their needs, their bare minimum needs for lighting, cell phone charging, maybe powering a couple appliances. But then you're also meeting the goal of building these large-scale plants and then just building enough transmission to where people can afford it and they can pay for the electricity. But at the same time, you're also supplying battery packs, and it's not going to be a huge imposition on your grid, right? Because the total kilowatt hour consumption from these smaller village populations is just so small. So
I think Nisha's answer is both.
Both, yes.
David, what's your view?
I would totally agree with her. That I think it's a hybrid. It's both.
Okay.
I mean, if the goal is, I think there's several goals. I started out by saying that I look at reliability, sustainability, and affordability. So let's just look at those three elements just for the moment. So if the goal is to ensure that you electrify areas, and you've got to look at the economics of those areas, you're going to go to smaller scale grids. You really are. You're going to evolve the grid.
Mm-hmm.
And pretty much is what she was saying. You're going to evolve the grid. You're not going to impose a hardship on the communities. But you're also going to look in the distant future and suggest that it's important that you have a plan to evolve that small scale grid so it can evolve to be a bulk power grid.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's a mixture of both, and it's really dependent upon the affordability and your sustainability goals.
Okay, good. And Dennis, what's your view on that?
Yeah, I agree with what has been said. I think it's not a question of either or, it's both. It has to be both. I mean, if you, for example, look at the goals from the Sustainable Energy for All, it's just for countries an imperative to get their people connected to electricity as well. So I think the question for governments is not if I should look into one or the other, but only how smart can I actually electrify.
Okay, how
So,
smart
and
can I electrify?
Smartness is obviously then directly linked to economics as well.
Yeah, good answer. Okay, other questions about the topic of scaling up and the building blocks? Reactions to the idea of building blocks? Did we hit the right ones? Are there more that we've missed? Are there other considerations for climate change that in order to try to meet the ambitious targets that are going to be discussed in Paris, are there other ideas that we should be putting on the table? Please.
Hi, my name is Marina Yachnis. I'm with Agility. So I wanted to ask a question about the notion of scaling and building blocks more generally, and the case study of South Africa got me thinking because they obviously have a very successful renewable energy procurement mechanism and program that's done very well. And, you know, people have looked to that case study and they've seen certain things the South African government has done to promote renewables. And they've wondered about how that could be scaled to the rest of Africa, like the IRP, that's one component. But at the same time, that case seems to differ quite a bit from the political and social and economic environments throughout the rest of Africa. So when looking at these building blocks, is it, I guess, what building block in particular do you think is most scalable? And do you think these are really applicable from country to country in a way that's meaningful?
Was it a question to me, right?
Probably, yeah.
I was looking to escape that one.
Okay.
No, it's in fact a very good question. I think one pragmatic response to this question is the way I see governments engaging with us. As I said before, we are not doing we are doing things based on the needs being expressed. So we are not moving into a region or a specific country with an idea and then trying to superimpose. When we are developing, we are currently developing this project I briefly mentioned for bringing good practices of governance with regard to the integrated resource planning to the rest of the region. So we have especially interest from Zimbabwe and Namibia telling us, okay, we are in the midst of either putting in place for the first time ever an IRP, or we are revisiting the existing one. So they have invited us to work together with them. So this is for me a good way of understanding what that this project can actually have an impact. And then based on this, we're going to see if there's other countries as well willing to engage with us on this. If not, we have to try differently. That means that we haven't really really considered all the factors which are different in these jurisdictions. But I see interest more and more growing from these countries in general with regard to developing integrated resource plans. Yeah. And please.
I'd like to offer one additional comment. The folks in the audience who know me know that I've been a fairly persistent advocate for solvent, bankable utilities being one of the building blocks, but we don't put it in the list because it's hard to accomplish and it depends on a lot of time and political will. And so the basic idea behind that building block is if you've got a bankrupt utility building anything, whether it's renewables or new thermal generation or extending the grid, is a terrible challenge because they're short of funds. Whereas if you have a very healthy utility, like Kenya is a case in point, they have more capacity. They have more, we're calling it resilience nowadays, financially, to be able to stretch and build a new line somewhere or to build a solar park, common infrastructure.
Excellent. I totally agree.
I figured with two regulators on the panel that they might like cost recovery, but it's something I share.
He stressed it in his slide, and I agree with him.
Okay, good.
No, I took out this one slide showing the level of prices or average tariffs in that region,
Mhm.
if you look at it, is not showing a very good picture these days, actually.
You're right.
I just want to offer one perspective, I guess, and maybe it's covered under effective grid integration, but the U.S., and I think, David, you'd speak to this better than me, is the U.S. has these regional transmission organizations that, you know, are so sophisticated where they can kind of balance the supply and demand of electricity on a, I don't know, per second, per 10-second interval, and turn on generators, turn them off where you need them. And when you're trying to develop all these renewables, and especially in India when they have such a huge target, I know that that system doesn't quite exist yet, and they're trying to build that out. So how do you do competitive procurement of renewables when you don't have all of your generation potential
Right.
accounted for, I guess, in a way? So that's something that's, I think that's maybe a precursor to some of the stuff that we're talking about.
So that suggests clear market rules. So not only if you look at the regulatory climate, which I think is essential, and I appreciate your point about the healthiness of the utilities, they remain healthy if they have some element of cost recovery, some assuredness that they'll recover costs. But also, it's important that you have market signals that permit the development of a market that can encourage the development of these technologies and the sustainability of these technologies. Those are the kinds of things that we have in the U.S. The challenge that we are evolving right now in the U.S. is how you take those regional transmission organizations, these markets that are created throughout the U.S., and then overlay them with what's occurring in the U.S. with respect to the Clean Power Plan. Clean Power Plan suggests that individual power plants in states, and the states have certain carbon goals, and there's a big debate, do you look at individual facilities or do you look at the market? I'm a believer that the market can give you better solutions, but you have to have a regulatory framework that encourages that market to be robust.
Yeah, good point. Thank you.
Thank you. Vikas Pandey from Windrock International. Just following up on Alan's question earlier. I mean, this question about do you do both, or in terms of the grid versus the off-grid solutions. I mean, sure you want to do both, but the situation is neither is being done, right? So you're talking about countries that have, 2% electrification, 5% electrification. So to plan on both, I mean, while that might be ideal, is not something anybody has resources for. In fact, don't you think that in many countries, one of the building blocks that's needed is for government to mark out clearly where the grid cannot get to in 15 years, 20 years, in order to create that enabling environment for other actors to come in. And I mean, one of the things I saw in Tanzania, for example, is that their tariff changes when the grid gets to a location. I mean, that's a big uncertainty for any mini-grid operator. If, the avoided cost compared to diesel versus avoided cost compared to the grid is very different.
Yes.
And so until you mark out that these are the areas where the grid is unlikely to get to, I mean, I think you're not going to get those investments in the alternative because they require a higher tariff, they require captive, a market. It's difficult to move that, particular infrastructure elsewhere. And oftentimes even the reputation that the grid is coming sometimes ruins that investment.
Okay.
So if you could elaborate on this point about,
Okay.
both or
Good.
one or the other.
Thank you. Anyone want to comment?
Go ahead.
The Tanzania case, the grid part is very good. A very good point. It's the past. That's what they have put in place in 2008, and they saw, because of also that part you just mentioned, what happens to my tariff when the big grid comes, and then I face different avoided costs and different support. They are currently embarking in rule changes, and I would be surprised if in the future they would still have such a part being written in the rules. But it really depends on the regulator and the ministries whether they see this as being a big barrier. But I think in this specific case for Tanzania, it is the case. Yeah. They also have put in place a rural electrification agency. So in theory and also more and more in practice, they, from an institutional perspective, they seem to be well placed to understand the issues at hand. Of course, they need time to figure it out, but they will come probably to similar conclusions you just mentioned briefly as well, that depending on the location, you will have grids coming over a specific time, and depending on the location, you won't at all. And it is very important to identify these locations as well while you're developing the policies. But I see, at least for this specific case in Tanzania, there's, with the institutions they have put in place, they have set themselves up into the right direction. Yeah.
Okay, we have time for two last quick questions. You've had your hand up there. Sir, it's you. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Doug Shackelford, I'm with D4 Energy.
Yeah.
There is this huge picture that everybody draws, markets, grids, international, big data. But until you get down to site specifics, how are we going to build this plant and how are we going to sell the whatever they're making here, the renewable energy here? Until you get down to those individual places, it's just talk. Now, how do you get away from that?
How do you get away from just talk?
Yeah.
I don't know.
I don't know. I mean, you're raising a good point. I would say it's politics. So how do you get away from politics? You don't.
I actually have a response because I didn't get to say anything on behalf of competition so far. As I mentioned earlier, competition is important to scaling up renewables because it compresses prices. The lower the price, the higher the demand. And so one of the things that countries are doing is within a region or a state or a solar park, they're saying whoever offers the lowest price gets the power purchase agreement.
Yep.
So it's really the price that determines the plant, not the location.
But even with that, there's always going to be a concern about cost recovery. So is that tariff that you sign, does the government back it up? Does the government guarantee
Yeah.
that you'll get cost recovery?
That's right.
So unless you have that element, that's right. Unless you have that element,
That's right.
then it's not going to take place. I can go in and bid the lowest price, but I want some certainty that if I make that investment, I'm going to get cost recovery.
That's right. Any other comments on that? Location versus price and
Yeah,
competition?
maybe on the location. Again, the Tanzania case, probably just because I was there a week ago. Background. What kind of background are you talking about? So a study or something?
A context, she's just saying.
Just what's the context for
context.
Tanzania?
The context.
Context. Context. The background. What's the background?
Like, what's the case
Yeah.
about? Yeah, what happened? Like,
Well, I think they are. I'm still not sure if I get your question fully right. I think when we moved in, we tried to assess the situation on Tanzania, seeing what were the barriers. And this is what I presented. And the next stage will be to figure out what to do better and how to actually move from talks to investments. Yeah. Is this roughly answering your question? Okay.
So Roger Mark reminds me that we've come to the end of our discussion here. I'd like to thank our three excellent panelists for your presentations. And thank you all for your questions. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, appreciate it.